During the first 5 years following the presidency of Andrew Jackson, 3 different men held the job of President of the United States. They were Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, and John Tyler. The first man, Martin Van Buren, had served as vice president under Jackson and was his hand-picked choice to be the 8th president. The second man, William Henry Harrison, America's 9th president, died after only a month in office, and his term was finished out by his vice president, John Tyler, who became the 10th president of the United States upon Harrison's death. Under these 3 presidents, the American frontier was pushed far to the west. The U.S. population reached 20 million, and the sale and settlement of public lands became a major focus of the federal government. Shortly after Martin Van Buren was sworn in as president in 1837, the year Michigan became a state, an economic disaster struck the nation. The Panic of 1837 resulted from the abrupt closure of a large number of American banks. These bank failures plunged the United States into the first major depression or severe economic downturn in its history. But the disaster President Van Buren confronted was not of his making and can be traced back to the actions of his predecessor, Andrew Jackson. For Jackson had attempted to destroy the Bank of the United States, the well-established private bank that handled the money of the federal government, and that was run by his political enemies. This bank also oversaw the activities of America's small state banks. Jackson used his power as president to veto, that is, override, the law that allowed the Bank of the United States to operate, and he ordered that all the government's money be withdrawn from it. As a result, responsible oversight of the activities of America's banking industry was lost. Jackson's actions made it much easier for banks to make risky loans to unscrupulous land speculators, people who bought and sold government land to make a profit. In the 1830s, small banks issued their own paper money to make loans. It was supposed to be backed up with gold or silver equal to its face value, but it rarely was. Banks make money by charging interest fees for loans. The more loans they make, the more interest they are paid. But back then, the amount of paper money the banks loaned out greatly exceeded their gold and silver reserves. When ordinary American citizens heard about this situation, they panicked and tried to withdraw their money from the banks as gold or silver coins. But the bankers either offered them worthless paper money or else turned them away. Soon the banks shut down. People lost their life savings. Businesses failed. Unemployment soared. And soon the entire American economy collapsed. President Van Buren was blamed for not fixing the nation's money problems. And in the election of 1840, Van Buren, a Democrat, was defeated in a landslide by William Henry Harrison, a member of the Whig Party, a political party originally formed to oppose Andrew Jackson. However, in April of 1841, after only 1 month in office, Harrison, the 9th U.S. president, died of pneumonia, and as specified by law, his vice president, John Tyler, automatically became the 10th President of the United States. The year John Tyler took over as president, 1841, Congress passed a law called the Preemption Act that had a very powerful effect upon opening up the American West to settlement. Before this law was passed, people known as squatters would often settle on government land without actually buying it. They would cut down trees and burn the stumps to clear the land for farming. Then they would build a cabin and move in with their belongings, even though they didn't really own the land. Squatters were quite commonplace back in the early 1840s, but so were the land speculators called claim jumpers. Claim jumpers would team up with lawyers and take the squatters' land away from them and resell it for big profits. In that way, the claim jumpers could get rich from all the work the squatters had put into the land and buildings. The Preemption Act of 1841 gave the squatters the right to purchase up to 160 acres of the land upon which they had settled for a mere $1.25 per acre before the claim jumpers could buy it out from under them. This law set the stage for the very important Homestead Act, passed 21 years later, that offered 160 acres of free land to people willing to make improvements and live upon it for 5 years. As a result of these laws, millions of acres of land passed from the federal government into private hands, and hundreds of thousands of new farms were established. Many of the farms were established by underprivileged European immigrants who, after 1840, had begun to pour into the United States. As can be seen from this bar graph, about 1,800,000 immigrants came to the USA during the 1840s, a figure more than double the 700,000 that arrived during the previous 2 decades. By the time the Preemption Act finally expired in 1891, nearly 13 million more people had immigrated to the United States, and most of them had come because of the availability of free or inexpensive land. In 1841, as the first big surge of new immigrants from Europe began to arrive on America's East Coast, far away on the West Coast, the first group of American pioneers reached California by covered wagon. Back then, California, like Texas, was still part of Mexico. The Mexican government had started to break up the vast lands of the old Spanish missions and open them up for settlement. In many cases, the mission buildings were sold off and their churches were abandoned. At that time, California's Russian fur trading and farming colony of Fort Ross, founded back in 1812, had pretty much been abandoned. Much of what the departing Russian colonists didn't want to keep was sold to an enterprising Swiss immigrant named John Augustus Sutter, a man who had just received a 50,000-acre land grant from the Mexican government. In the wide, fertile valley to the east of Fort Ross, Sutter was constructing a collection of buildings behind a high wall of adobe brick. His new outpost, called Sutter's Fort, was mainly intended as a way to make money by serving the needs of the growing number of pioneers coming to California. For example, it had workshops, sleeping quarters, various storerooms, and even a distillery for making whiskey. In the 1840s, Sutter's Fort was the western terminal for the wagon trains arriving from the east, and it was because of this fort that the city of Sacramento, the present-day capital of California, came to be founded nearby. In 1843, the third year of John Tyler's presidency, the land directly north of Mexican California was called the Oregon Country. This was a vast, sparsely populated region that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean and extended as far as the southern border of Russian Alaska. At that time, the Oregon Country was still under the joint control of Great Britain and the United States. Back then, Britain dominated the region and maintained a huge fur trading outpost there called Fort Vancouver on the banks of the Columbia River. Their outpost, which was regularly visited by trading ships, was operated by the powerful Hudson's Bay Company of London. But British dominance of the region was about to end. For just to the south of Fort Vancouver lay the fertile valley of the Willamette River, where tiny groups of whites had started to settle and where many others would soon follow. 1843 was the year an American missionary led a great migration of 1,000 pioneers in a wagon train west from Independence, Missouri, to the Oregon country along what came to be called the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was a rough, rutted track about 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometers long, the longest of the great overland routes used in the westward expansion of the United States. Crossing it required making a difficult journey of 6 months. Most pioneers traveled in covered wagons, but some walked or even pushed wheelbarrows full of their belongings. Back in the 1840s, the pioneers referred to most of the land they passed over on the Oregon Trail as the Great American Desert, because they did not think that such dry, barren land could ever be farmed. Over the years, the Oregon Trail came to be dotted with forts. The biggest one was Fort Laramie in today's state of Wyoming. Here the pioneers could rest up in safety and even obtain many needed supplies at the fort's store before they continued on with their long journey west. Not far from Fort Laramie, it is still possible to see where the pioneers carved their names in the rocks as a lasting reminder that they had passed by. In the present-day state of Idaho, the Oregon Trail branched. The southern branch, called the California Trail, ended at Sutter's Fort in Sacramento. The northern branch continued on toward Fort Vancouver. When the pioneers on the Oregon Trail finally reached the deep rocky gorge of the Columbia River, they knew they were close to their goal. Here the wagons were often placed on rafts and floated down to Fort Vancouver. And from there, the rich land of the Willamette Valley was just a short distance away. The very first pioneers that crossed the Oregon Trail ended up settling on land that did not belong to the United States. In fact, when John Tyler's presidency came to a close in early 1845, the nation was quite a bit smaller than it is today. Up north, it ended at the Oregon country, and down south, along the border of the Republic of Texas. Americans wanted the vast land that lay to the west, and later that year, a writer coined the term manifest destiny to explain why. The concept of manifest destiny was based on 3 beliefs. First, that the nation needed more land for its rapidly growing population. Second, that Americans could bring economic growth and democracy to places where they had never existed before. And third, that American territorial expansion was blessed by God because it was morally right. Just before the term manifest destiny was first used, a new U.S. president, James K. Polk, was inaugurated. And amazingly, between that time in 1845 and when his term in office ended in 1849, the American nation had reached the shores of the Pacific Ocean. True or false? The Panic of 1837 resulted from increased taxation. True or false? William H. Harrison was president for only a month. True or false? Most American paper money became worthless in the 1830s. True or false? When John Tyler was president, California belonged to Spain. True or false? The Preemption Act was intended to promote land speculation.